I recently had the chance to sit down and have a conversation with my good friend, Dr. Graham Walker. Dr. Walker is a professor of theology and philosophy at the McAfee School of Theology in Atlanta, Georgia. That's where I went to seminary and earned my Master of Divinity degree back in, I think I graduated in 2010. While I was there, I spent time taking classes with Dr. Walker. And really, to be honest, those classes have resonated and rippled throughout my life. They have ended up being, the ideas have ended up being things that have formed me and influenced me in quite a substantial way. And so I'm delighted to be able to share this conversation with you where Dr. Walker touches on some of those ideas that I think have the potential to be so influential to all of us as we think about what it means for us to understand our own stories as well as to be storytellers. So I hope you enjoy this conversation that I had with Dr. Walker, that it inspires you and prompts you to think about new stories that you have to tell, or maybe old stories that you have to tell, or maybe stories that you are currently experiencing and that you want to tell.
Dr. Walker, thank you so much for joining my visual storytelling class. It's a delight to get to spend a little bit of time talking with you. Um, Ever since I was in seminary, some of the ideas that you and I talked about in classes were interesting to me, and they've been floating around in the back of my mind and the front of my mind ever since then. And I'm excited to have you spend a little bit of time talking with me and sharing that with my students. So
Glad to be
welcome.
glad to be here. Thanks a bunch, BJ. Yeah, I enjoy working with former students as colleagues on a variety of different things, and so this just feels natural. And I'm thrilled to be here with you and your class. Yeah.
I appreciate it. Um, so why don't we just start with sort of a softball question? What are some of your favorite stories and or myths?
I mean, that's so biographical and
Yep.
autobiographical. It's really interesting. So early on, my parents tell me that I had a hat rack as a child, that I had all sorts of different kind of hats on, and whatever came on the television, I would run, grab that hat so I could sit there and fit into the bigger role that was going on. And I found some of those hats recently. Some of those army hats that Dad had, and some of the the fire engine type things and stuff like that. They kind of brought me a sense of identity as a child. It's really an interesting thing when you're a child and you're looking to fit into the world. You're pretty conscious of looking for roles and identities to fit in. I remember the Japanese anime Astro Boy when I was a kid, and so I was really into that. And as each different show would come on, Navy Log and Combat and all of those kinds of things, I found myself involved in getting into that bigger story. My parents moved overseas when I was young, and we went on a journey. It was before the 747s. So we moved to Singapore. And so we took the slow boat and went overseas
Wow.
by way of ship. And, uh, and it was quite a journey, because when you're on a ship, you have time to prepare for where you're going to.
Yeah.
So I worked on language study and things like that, Japanese. So by the time we got to Japan, I could help the family get through Japan, and then we caught the ship on to Hong Kong, and finally we flew the last leg from Hong Kong down to Singapore, and and it was like a real transition for me, and it introduced me to a whole new set of stories.
Yeah.
So the Ramayana was a big story for me from that point
Mm.
on, and a variety of different stories that just show you how to make your way through the world when we're all brand new at it. Our consciousness is a
Wow.
gift, and we have it one time through, and we look for ways, pathways to follow. And so some of those kinds
Wow.
of stories shape me. Yeah.
How old were you when your family moved?
I was 12 years old when we finally got on the ship.
Yeah.
So it was an impressionable time. And I spent all of my junior high and high school years in Singapore and learned new languages and learned new ways of opening up new storylines in my life. So
Yeah.
it was really fascinating for me to be introduced to Hinduism, Buddhism,
Hmm.
Islam, and then all of the different tribal communities in Malaysia. That was fascinating for me growing up.
So this is off script for some of the ideas and questions that you and I like just briefly discussed, but I can't help but be interested and ask. When you reflect back on that, do you like when you reflect back on the journey of you moving at that age and then eventually being here in the United States right now, do you conceptualize it in terms of Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey?
I do now.
Yeah,
But I have to admit, I knew I was on a journey um, in the very beginning, because
yeah,
when my parents sat me down, I remember my father sat me down in the big leather chair in the living room, right? I'm a
yeah.
little guy at that point. And he says, "We're going to go and live halfway around the world." And I'm saying, "No, I'll stay here with grandma and grandpa. You all have a nice trip. I mean, I hope it goes well for you, but I'm staying with grandma and grandpa." And they said, "Well, that's kind of not how it works with the family. You're going to need to be going with us." And so it became real to me that we were on a journey. They didn't know what they were going into. I didn't know what I was going into,
Yeah.
but nonetheless, we were crossing some form of threshold. And
Mhm.
I knew that. I knew that. And so everything was, how can we adapt? How can we adjust on the way? So I knew it was a transition that was not like any of my other friends were seeming to need to move on.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
Mhm.
Um, so to sort of move on a little bit, uh, what do you think myth is or story?
Yeah, and I've got a little bit of a PowerPoint kind of thing, some slides I
Okay.
can show you on that.
Yeah, that'd be great.
But just up front, it's an internal rhythm that gives you a sense of origin, purpose, and destiny. And humanity seems to be narrative. We're narrative animals. Our
Mhm.
consciousness is organized around understanding, to some degree, where we come from, where we think we're going, and what
Mhm.
is that transition between those two.
Yeah.
So that's why the existentialist philosophers talk about imagining your own death and imagining your own end, because in
Mhm.
imagining your own end, you are forced to take um, full cognizance of where you are right now and where you are moving through time and space. So for me, a myth gives you a sense of origin. Who am I? Where do I come from? Where are my
Yeah.
background? What are my roots? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And where am I going? Am I transitioning beyond that? Am I moving in a direction, a horizon of new possibilities? And then, purpose. What is this transition between those two? So I would see that as origin, purpose, and destiny. Yeah.
That's great.
Let me,
You said you had some PowerPoint
yeah, let me
slides?
show you that way. And so we do this. Yeah. So um, pretty much we're a storied animal. Um, what it means to be humans. I exist by the stories I'm told and locate myself within. I exist as a testimony to the stories I tell. Um, it's interesting that of all the animals, we are the ones who look in the mirror and say, "Who am I today, and what will I be?" Um, it is a cognizant awareness that we are storytellers. And Elie Wiesel, who I studied with and wrote about significantly, he writes, God created humanity because he loves stories. I thought,
That's
I thought that is
beautiful.
great. Because we're such storied animals and God loves stories. That's the reason why we were created, to both tell stories and live within stories. And there are two fundamental kind of story patterns that I look at often. One is the plot, and that's where the protagonist remains the same in spite of changing and challenging conflicts around. So you can think
Mm,
of the Superman story. You always know that
yeah.
kryptonite is a thing, but you see him or other heroes of this ilk who move from one thing to another to another to another, and their character remains the same. On the other hand, there is the storyline, and that's where the protagonist changes in the process of meeting the challenges and conflicts that come her way or his way. It's a story of conversion. So
Mm,
you were asking me about my transition and living overseas earlier. Yeah, I would argue that the transition, when I got on that ship, the President Cleveland, and we sailed out under the Golden Gate Bridge, um, 21 days later, arriving, that great sea journey was a real threshold crossing for me. And I was never the same after that, because all of the kind of experiences that go along with those years of living in Singapore and Malaysia changed the way I saw the world, changed the way I could even speak language, changed the way I understood who I was.
mm,
So it was a storyline, not a
yeah.
plot. Yeah. Go ahead and kind of go a little bit. So when I talk about stories, I'm talking about in mythology, I'm talking about stories that give us that sense of identity as a deep-seated psychological rhythm or pattern that kind of locate who we are, and whereby we face developmental changes and crisis events, um, and where we find that sense of origin and our sense of purpose and our sense of destiny. And that's what I would see as a mythology, a personal mythology that shapes who we are. We're born into large stories, national stories. We're born into our own familial stories that we have. Um, but at some point, all of us need to affirm and choose the stories that we live within. And that gets back to the great existentialist philosophers who say, you know, you have the ability with your very flexible sense uh, of cultural aspects to choose the story that you live within. And we see this
Mm.
all the time with religious traditions and other things. That's familiar to you, I know,
Oh,
David.
yes.
So as you recall, up there at the top of the circle, and this would be moving in a counterclockwise direction, we typically find a pattern by which we go on a hero's journey. Joseph Campbell, for those of you who are not familiar with him, is one of America's greatest mythologists and the world's mythologists, as he provides a kind of a narrative form for how myths are actually lived out. And he says there's a call to adventure, whereby we're called out of the world in which we know so well. There are threshold crossings where we cross from one world to from the familiar to the unfamiliar. There are tests that come our way, whether those be trials and tribulations, they happen, and we have helpers along the way. At some point, there is a symbolic conflict whereby we establish a sense of who we are. And there's this elixir theft, or it's at this point, it means that we take away some sort of emblem or transitional object that represents how we have transitioned. You know, I sometimes remind the students that a diploma is one of those kinds of things. When you have the diploma in hand, they're not taking it away from you. You have made a transition, the symbolic conflict that you've gone through now represents a state of identity that is different. Cross back over to the other side and you carry that diploma with you, or you carry that symbol of transition with you, and you come back as a different person, or someone who has expanded their horizons and is able to move in different directions. But this is kind of a general outline of the way that goes.
Yeah.
May have seen the story of the Wizard of Oz kind of tells that out, and remember Dorothy crossing that and her helpers along the way. We remember the threshold crossing as she moves from one side to the other. And, they're not in Kansas anymore. It's a completely different world they find themselves. And she learns to negotiate just exactly what that looks like. Tests and trials come her way. And she's helped with helpers like the Straw Man, Tin Man, Cowardly Lion. And she also has these magical shoes somehow that represent her ability to sustain the symbolic conflict that takes place, of course. Then there's, the threshold return. She goes back home again. And she comes home and she finds herself a transformed person, having been on this journey. So the myth really does give some sort of ordered existence to how we understand who we are and our identity. Does that help kind of rethink and refocus this?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that something as complex and rich as the hero's journey, one can apply it to the Wizard of Oz. Actually, ever since I got to study with you at McAfee, I cannot help but analyze pretty much every story by way of the hero's journey.
Now there are angles on that hero's journey, right? So you can be a trickster in a system that is oppressive. You can be an underdog in a journey where you're on the side of the oppressed. So there are different patterns that the journey takes, but Joseph Campbell has given us at least one of the more basic patterns for seeing how a journey takes place. And you see this in many religions. So for example, you see Jesus coming to John the Baptist in both Matthew and Mark, and you see the baptismal ceremony. After the voice from heaven announces, "You are my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." You see that in the Gospel of Mark. Then Jesus is taken off and goes out into the wilderness, right, to face the temptations. And at that point, you see he is now crossing over into a threshold, and he's now on a journey. And the trials and tribulations have begun just there. But that's not unlike what you have in Buddhism, where you have Gautama himself is living within a palace, and he is protected from all suffering and evil and death. And yet he goes out beyond that passageway of that insulated life, and he sees death for the first time. He sees transition and suffering. And you see that begins his journey as well, to lead and to find his new identity as one who leads people from pain and suffering.
I'm curious what you think, and you've touched on this a little bit, but what do you see as the relationship between an individual's context and myth or story in general? So, what's the relationship between like what I'm experiencing and the stories that I'm constructing? We could think about that from my personal life, national, Western life in general, society, like the entire planet, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think we're now more than ever recognizing the role of how stories have shaped who we are. So in our schooling and in our upbringing and in our more homogenous communities, we've been taught to frame our national identity, our local identities in particular ways. But at the same time, now more than ever, we are bumping into other narratives, other stories, and other people's narratives. And so there's a real politic of negotiating what our stories will be. So you find that how we can hear somebody else's story helps shape the way we respond and reframe our stories as well. So there seems to be a certain amount of uneasiness right now as our society tries to learn to hear other narratives, hear other people's stories, give recognition to the stories of others. And in the process, there for many is a defensiveness that we need to kind of learn to sit with a little bit and not read this as a disconfirming story of who we are. Because obviously the way we frame ourselves is quite different than the way somebody else frames themselves. And learning to be a story listener might mean that we might have to modulate, shift, or reframe the way we've always understood ourselves. So you can see how the personal stories that we have in line with the personal stories of others might have a clash. It's often interesting to me when you get together with people. Can we learn to ask the questions that draw out the stories of other people? Or do we feel the need to tell our stories as fast as possible so they know who we are? It's an interesting dynamic, and it just shows us how storied we really are. Any conversation, people want to immediately start telling where they come from and who they are and what their background is. And it takes some talent and art and some patience to learn to hear the stories of other people.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is backtracking just a little bit. Why do you think, I mean, and maybe this isn't much of a different answer than what you've already said, but why do you think we go back to myth over and over and over? Is there anything else you might add to that other than, oh, it gives us our identity?
I mean, I can go to where philosophers and theologians have helped us here in this regard. And they talk about the fact that we are exocentric. By that, I mean, we find our identity centered outside of ourselves. So just in just understanding who we are and why we are here and what is our purpose, we have to extend our awareness outside our biological condition. So a community of honeybees, the life revolves around the queen. The queen is everything. Within her, the whole social contract exists. If my Boston Terrier looks in the mirror, the Boston Terrier sees another dog and sniffs the mirror to see if it is another dog. There is no sense of who am I about that. But for a human being, our sense of identity really does revolve in something outside of our biological conditionedness. So we are forced to build our whole agenda for living outside. Now that gives us enormous flexibility because we are cultural animals and our stories are outside of us. It leaves us open to enormous possibilities and adaptability. We can go outside of our, as astronauts, we can find ourselves with scuba gear under the ocean. We can find ourselves in the coldest, the hottest environments because of our ability to create narratives that allow a world to exist apart from our biological conditionedness. And that's important for why human beings need stories. They provide our ability to function and live. Without stories, it's very difficult to even imagine that.
Yeah, and so with that as a sort of framework, I'm really interested in just personally thinking about and want my students to think about sort of the coming together of that need for storytelling, like what you're describing, as well as the national context that we find ourselves in,
Right.
as well as maybe some, this is a little vague and ambiguous, but a spiritual context, whatever that means, because I think that many of us, regardless of what faith we might identify with, have a sense of spirituality. So what do you see, what are some of the things that you see in terms of that context and the need for storytelling that make the 21st century difficult, challenging, as well as full of possibilities?
Mhm. Yeah, I spend a little time with that in classes that I teach on theology and science, because science, as evolving and developing, is helping us to address so many of our crises of the moment. So our ecological crisis. We're in the middle of the storytelling right now with regards to vaccinations and how well they work and those kinds of things. And you have the difficulty there with the communities and how science has been presented to them as to how they will respond to even the vaccination situation we're in, or even the slow development of global warming and climate change that we have going on right now. But as we back up and we start to look at, the age of the earth, and then we begin to realize that the cosmos itself is involved in a story, right? So you go back 13.8 billion years and you go, wow, this is an amazing story. Impossible for us to kind of wrap our heads around, since human beings don't think into deep time very well. But you begin to realize that there is a journey and there is a story to the cosmos itself. And on that kind of storyline, it kind of blends all of our other stories together. We're in a common story together. And that common story together means that whatever our cultural story may have been, whatever even our personal story may have been, it's not absolute. It's part of a greater journey
Yeah.
of the whole biosphere. And biohistory is an amazing thing when you take a look at it. You start with T equals 0 and the Big Bang, and then you move spread across the universe, and you see the birth of stars and stardust and the deep chemicals and minerals, and that emerge out of that to become complex. And then you take all the way down to a cognizant point where we can actually be aware of that. That's quite a journey to be on together. And that may be one of, to me, the greatest growth of mythology going forward, is that we recognize that with all the different mythologies we have used and sustained ourselves
Yeah.
to get to this point, the fact is we share a common story that's even bigger than that, going on into the future and how we relate. So I find that, to me, deeply spiritual.
Mhm.
Notice it's not necessarily religious.
Yeah.
But it is deeply spiritual. We are on that journey together. And then likewise, just our own personal biological life. Just think about it for a moment. In utero, when you were coming into being, you even before you could even think, you were bathed in community. The umbilical cord that attached you, your brain was taught to expect community. And then at birth, you're thrown into the world of being an individual identity, seeking community yet again. So the cries of an infant are the cries of reconnection. Bring me back to that state of perfect bliss where I found myself, where I grew, where my brain developed. And for the rest of your life, you are looking to make connection and reconnection with mother figures, father figures, friends, spouses, and on. Your whole agenda has been set early on by your presupposition of community in utero. Your brain has been bathed in that. So part of your narrative is being able to, as a human being, is to be able to create community. And that's an underlying theme that just runs throughout all of the stories that we may have, because it's our own personal, very personal biological theme that has been given to us by this greater biohistory that has gone on for 13.8 billion years. It's certainly amazing when you think about it. That's a deeply spiritual journey. So when you find your partner, when you find someone who is close to you, wherever you are in time, you are a participant in a deeply long story. And when you lose a partner, it's a deeply painful experience that shows the angst and pain, not just of you personally at that time, but of 13.8 billion years of development of that storyline.
Absolutely. I wonder, so hearing that, I'm thinking back to something that we've discussed in the last time we talked, but also something that stuck with me over the years since being at McAfee, and that's the word just slipped my mind. The book Worlds Within a Congregation.
Yes.
Different.
Yes. Yeah. Theological Worlds by
Theological Worlds. There we go.
William Paul Jones. Yes.
And I've sort of come to think of those as completely separate from any one specific faith system.
Yeah.
And I wonder, in your view, like if you're thinking about storytellers in the 21st century, and it's visual storytellers, it's our responsibility to look inside of ourselves, understand our stories, look outside of ourselves, understand the stories happening around us,
yes,
and come up with something relevant to say. Do you see any intersection between those two things, the storyteller's responsibility and the theological worlds?
Yeah, sure. Let me go back for your students. Let me go back a little bit and go back to the PowerPoint. I think I have some of that in there, and I can show you how that would become relevant. This chart that you have here kind of shows you some of the narrative rhythms and storytelling rhythms down that left-hand column. If you're looking at the top, you see separation and reunion, followed going down the column. You see conflict and vindication, see emptiness and fulfillment, you see condemnation and forgiveness, and you see suffering and endurance. What Jones in his book Theological Worlds helps us to see is that these are at least 5 different forms of storytelling patterns that we have. I've changed them a little bit so that they're more applicable to just overall the mythologies that we live by and not theological language. But let's go horizontally across on separation and reunion. And so if you remember, almost any story you tell has a sense of introduction, and then it has a sense of disequilibrium. Something happens to change where you are. So for example, the story I was telling about our own birth, if we're bathed in the assumption of unity in utero, then the birth itself is a crisis moment, because now we become a separate individual. And so we would then have a feeling of longing for reconnection. And so our human condition would have been thrown into isolation and abandonment, and to feel like an alien or an orphan. And our discovery would be to find our way back home, to find our way with helpers, to find our way to a sense of harmony and community again. So you see, as I move across separation, reunion, I move through that whole cycle of the story as it would be told. Likewise, conflict and vindication follows a similar pattern. To be in conflict means to be oppressed. It means to be suppressed by someone, and therefore a sense of anger emerges within oneself, and the metaphor of a warrior emerges at that point, and the sense of combat. How do I push off this oppressive force that is holding me? and you find comrades and liberators as those who are your helpers along the way towards hopefully a whole new world where you escape whatever boundaries or bondage that may have been. And that may be social, real, physical bondage, or it also might be chemical addictions. It might be a variety of different ways in which you see and understand your sense of story of where you find yourself. Emptiness and fulfillment, as we move on down that left-hand column and now running across the horizontal, is a story about I don't see who I am. I don't see where I belong. I don't see what is my meaning or purpose in life. And it has a sense of ache and it has a sense of void. One knows deep down that they should have a sense of purpose, or they could have a sense of purpose. They just don't know what it is, and they feel self-estranged. They feel insignificant. They feel as an outcast, only to have models who would like show the way and lead them in modeling forth a purpose and a life well lived. I've heard this story many times from some of my older friends who say, I'm not so much worried about the afterlife or things of this nature. I am definitely wanting to know that I have lived a life of meaning and purpose. And so that's where this emptiness and fulfillment narrative fits in. Others see themselves on the kind of the role of condemnation and forgiveness, and that's a well played story throughout many religious traditions. To once I was blind, but now I can see. Once I was lost, now I'm saved. That kind of storyline. And then finally, suffering and endurance is probably one of the themes that all human beings face. And that is, how do we carry the real pain that comes into our lives that overwhelms us, that seems to push us down? I'm always fascinated by the word suffer itself, suffere, Latin being to carry, and suf meaning under. So actually to suffer in kind of the real meaning of the word is to have an undercarriage, or like a wheelbarrow that can actually help carry the burden or the weight that is on us. But you have to, in many cases, have a companion along the way that helps us do that. And so helpers, in this sense, the people we meet in community are those who help us carry a burden, and it gives us an ability to survive and carry pain with integrity and with a sense of companionship. So these five different storylines that you see moving from on the left-hand column down and then from left to right really kind of shape a pattern by which many people tell their stories and where they see themselves. Now, I've found that no matter what religious tradition I meet somebody in, they can tell their story by at least one or two of these patterns. And likewise, I've learned to listen to people and their storytelling, and I can hear the storytelling pattern that they are using, often from one of these five storytelling patterns. So this is helpful for me anyway, when I think of what we mean by stories and how they shape our lives.
I think that when I consider narrative art, and specifically drawing or painting, which, that's so different from film, because film, you have the opportunity to have a whole chronology.
Right.
And with something like drawing or painting, it's singular. And so it changes the dynamic. But when I think about drawing and painting stories, it's interesting for me to think about, someone like, say, a Caravaggio, conceptualizing something like The Calling of Matthew, and considering where it fits, or how he's understanding himself, and then how he's understanding biblical narrative, and then how he's understanding his role in storytelling. So I wonder, this puts you on the spot a little bit, but do you have any any visual storytellers that you are particularly drawn to and that you see as being um, meaningful to you personally? And then I want to expand out to a final question about storytelling going forward.
Okay. Yes. I've often been enthralled with the work of Frida Kahlo.
Mhm.
She fits very much into that suffering and endurance at the bottom of the screen, the world number 5. I find that she has an incredible ability to create an understanding of pain, but at the same time, within that understanding of pain, she is able to give the portrayal of her identity as both indigenous and European together. So she's
Mm,
weaving together a narrative that is deeply from her perspective and her own personal story. You can see the indigenous art in her work. You can see the pain of her life, and you can see the meeting place of her both European background through her father and the indigenous background through her mother as they meet. And it's just fascinating to me of her ability to do that. And there's any number of her works that kind of reflect that. She is she's very precise in bringing those worlds together around the narrative of how do you live with suffering and pain in one's life. And and that's really important given the fact that all of us experience some sort of pain and suffering. How do we carry it? And she has shown us quite
mm.
quite clearly how to do that. Another artist that I just really find fascinating is Marc Chagall. Marc Chagall
Oh
and his
gosh.
yeah, and his Jewish background often portrays for me the separation and reunion, the longing themes,
Yep.
and you can see that in a number of his
Yeah.
works. So I find those two artists extremely helpful for me to gather a narrative together at the same time, to do it in a material form that it doesn't look, it doesn't roll out like a film does. It doesn't
Hmm.
have an introduction, it doesn't have development, it doesn't, but you can see it's at the denouement, it's at the point of recognition that both of those artists really capture for me quite well. um, the kind of the narrative storytelling mythology that runs behind their ability to paint and to draw. Yeah.
I wonder, just as a sort of, we're getting close to our time, but as a final point of conversation, um, topic of conversation, what, um, as someone who has thought a lot about story in general, um, and as someone who's thought a lot about faith systems, and I think that you've also spent a lot of time thinking about where we're at culturally, sociologically, philosophically. What are some narrative issues that you would be interested in seeing explored visually?
At this point in time, I'm really looking for the ability of storytellers to be able to demonstrate the mystery of the other, to be able
Mm,
to hear from the other, to be able to demonstrate a horizon of possibility that hasn't been imagined. Even as I stepped on that ship and started heading out for Asia on a slow boat to Singapore, I knew that I was on a journey that was going to change me. I
right.
would love to be able to see in graphic, in portrait, something that inspires me to look deeper, to look further, to be excited rather. It's the emotions of fear that often cause people to retreat into a well-known mythological structure that gives them a sense of security. But I would love to be able to see something that draws us out and wants to make us look to a horizon, and with mystery, with fascination.
Yeah.
And, you know, Mircea Eliade, the great famous historian and phenomenologist, talks about fear and fascination as being the two things that really kind of shape the way people tell their stories. I would love to be able to see this fascination for the other develop as opposed to the rebounding fear. We're at a stage of recognizable fear in our cultural storytelling. I understand that. It feels like one person telling their story is a disconfirmation of your story.
Yeah.
And that creates a sense of fear, and then people withdraw into it. On the other hand, there's such a continuum of stories being told right now that it also feels cognitively dissonant. So who am I? Where am I? If their story is right, then my story has to be wrong. That's not the case either. I would love to see a sense of comfortable identity with where one comes from, but yet a fascination with what could be and an open horizon. So how to capture that in telling a story and in art is a struggle, I think, philosophically, and I think it's one that has great potential for our world community. And we're a dangerous people, capable of such beautiful dreams
Yeah.
and horrible nightmares. So there has never been a time more important for just that, to be able to dream of possibilities and horizons that show a fascination with where we can go on this journey.
That makes me think of a common critique that I hear and that I often feel with art coming out of the late 20th century and early 21st century, and that is that it tends to be ironic, and focus on irony, and to focus on um, the dissolution of life. And if there's any art in the art world that is genuine and authentic and is looking for the sublime or the transcendent, is generally thought of as naive and kitsch. And I agree with you. Like, that's something that I actually want to see. Like, I understand that we know what life is like, coming untethered and unbound, but I think that we want to see something that points us forward and in a bigger towards a bigger description of what life is.
Yeah, I think, and that's a good place to kind of I leave it, I think. And we're part of
Yeah.
a bigger story, a biohistory that continues to expand, and we can be affirmative of where we are moving, or we can be blinded by our stories that limit the horizon of the others.
Yeah.
But there's possibility for great growth, I see.
Dr. Walker, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation and for sharing your thoughts and insights with my class. I really, really appreciate it.
Well, I enjoy being here. It's great. And it's always a pleasure to work with you, BJ. Looking forward to seeing how your class does.